Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Webequie Supply Road Environmental Assessment Phase Round 1 presentation to you at Aroland First Nation. So today we're going to talk a bit about the project, explain where we are in the project and in the federal regulatory process and as well as the provincial regulatory process. We'll talk about some of the activities involved in the environmental assessment and then we're going to, so that'll be part of the main presentation. And then after the presentation, I'll come back on and talk a little bit about what we've heard from Aroland First Nation. We haven't heard a lot from the First Nation on this particular project, but we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open up the floor to any questions that community members may have. So without further ado, let's watch the environmental assessment phase round 1 presentation, and please think of your questions as we watch the presentation, and we'll come back and talk again in about 30 minutes. Welcome to the Webequie Supply Road Environmental Assessment Phase Round 1 presentation. Today we are going to talk about the environmental assessment steps, what we have learned from communities, the importance of Indigenous knowledge, road route alternatives, and what happens next. For background, Webequie First Nation is about 250 kilometers from the Hudson Bay and James Bay coasts, and the road runs south of Webequie and then east to the Ring of Fire area. The purpose of the Webequie Supply Road is to move people and supplies to the Ring of Fire area, create jobs and business opportunities for community members, as well as skills training opportunities for young people. This would be done in a way that will preserve and strengthen the community's language and culture. The road will be 107 kilometers long, with 17 kilometers of the length actually within Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The corridor planning area is 2 kilometers, but the actual cleared area will be 35 meters. The road will make 3 large water crossings, one across Winisk Lake and the other 2 across rivers. And the project will also include temporary pits and quarries, equipment storage areas, and construction camps. Now we are going to talk about the environmental and impact assessment processes. There are 2 environmental assessments actually going on. There's an Ontario or provincial one and a Canada or federal one. Webequie is also doing their own internal assessment of the project. At the end, one report is created for review by Ontario and Canada. There is coordination between the federal and provincial EA processes at different points in the process. One body of documentation, though, one report, one body of documentation will be produced to address requirements of both the terms of reference, which is the provincial work plan for the EA, and what we call the tailored impact statement guidelines, which is basically the work plan from the federal side. Now we are going to talk about the communication we have had with Indigenous communities. When we were developing the work plan for the environmental assessment, also known as the terms of reference for the provincial environmental assessment process, we created a project website. We sent notices to communities, did virtual and in-person community meetings, and made project information available in many ways, such as through the website or by mail. And we've also accommodated during COVID by switching a lot of our in-person meetings to virtual meetings. We have received comments on the environmental assessment terms of reference or environmental assessment work plan from many First Nations and First Nation organizations. These comments are wide-ranging. They talk about many, many different topics. Some of the topics are focused on Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests. There's cumulative effects and the need for regional assessment. So looking at the broader effects of the project and looking at the project from a much sort of higher level in combination with other projects that are either planned or exist in the area. There, we heard comments on protocols, so ways of communicating with communities and the consultation process. We heard comments on environmental assessment or impact assessment, the actual undertaking of that work. And then we also received comments on participation in capacity funding, providing resources to communities so that they have the capacity to be able to review documents and conduct their own, for example, Indigenous knowledge studies. There were other comments on ownership and maintenance or operations of the road. There were comments on socioeconomic impacts of the project. There were a number of comments on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water or water quality, and wildlife and plants had many comments as well. So there were comments from a lot of communities, a lot of First Nation organizations, and about many different subjects. Let's move now to talk a bit about the study plans. There are many studies involved in an environmental assessment. The technical team had to prepare detailed plans explaining to the federal government how these studies will be done. So these are very detailed sort of recipes as to how the work will be undertaken um, at a very technical level, and these were reviewed by the federal government, by experts in the federal government. So there were a number of different technical study plans prepared, and the subjects include geology, terrain and soils, surface and groundwater, air quality and climate change, noise and acoustic, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, socioeconomics, human health, visual environment, and cumulative effects. Our team also prepared fact sheets to summarize. Now we will talk about how an environmental assessment is done. There are many steps involved in an environmental assessment. One of the steps is to identify what we call valued components. Valued components are the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are important to community members, are of concern or value to the public, Indigenous peoples, federal, provincial authorities, and interested party. They are what people are concerned about. Then we have indicators. Indicators represent the resource, feature, or issue related to a valued component, so what's important to community members. And if these indicators are changed, they may demonstrate an effect on the environment. A better way probably to describe them is a way of measuring potential effects. And it's used in the assessment and evaluation of alternative routes and the overall effects of the project. Now let's talk a bit about assessment boundaries. For each thing that community members think is important to study in an environmental assessment, a valued component, a study area needs to be defined. These are different depending on the valued component, and that's a very important thing to remember. So there are three general study areas. What we call the project area or project footprint. Then we have 1 kilometer on either side of the road center, which is called the local study area, and the regional study area, which is 5 kilometers on each side of the center line of the road. Those are the general study areas. And this next map shows the 3 basic types of study areas relative to the 2 alternatives, the community-based alternative and the technically preferred alternative, which looks at the community-based alternative and makes minor changes to the route based on better terrain and soils and other factors. Let's now talk about the study areas for valued components more specifically. The study areas for valued components, or things that are important to community members, are determined by many different things, including what community members are saying, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous land and resource use, and Aboriginal and treaty rights. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about baseline studies. Think of baseline studies as a way of finding out the way things are now, so what we call existing conditions. And if we know that, we have something to compare to when looking at possible impacts of the project. So it's a snapshot, a picture of the way things are before the project. There are many studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment. These studies look at 3 general areas: the natural, or what we call biophysical, socioeconomic, and cultural. They're all under these categories. For example, let's look at natural or biophysical. Within that, we would have studies on vegetation, such as the peatlands or wetlands and forests, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, air quality and climate change, noise and vibration, visual environment, surface water, groundwater, and geology, terrain, and soils. So there are many studies on the natural or biophysical in the natural or biophysical category. Now, if we look at the socioeconomic, infrastructure and social services, then we might look at human health. Might look at land and resource use, or Indigenous knowledge and land and resource use. Then we look at another major category of studies, which is archaeological resources or built heritage or cultural heritage landscapes. So there are many groups of studies, and even within the studies that I mentioned, there are more studies that are done, more specific studies. For example, if we were to look at caribou, there are a number of different types of caribou studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. Let's now look at select valued components as examples. And this will hopefully help everyone sort of better understand what I've just been talking about. So let's look at study areas for wildlife. The general or local study area would be a 1 kilometer buffer, as I mentioned before, from the center line of the alternatives. 500 kilometers from what we call supportive infrastructure. So these are things other than the road that are required as part of the construction or operation of the project. These might be camps or aggregate or rock source areas or access roads. And then the regional study area, general regional study area, extends 5 kilometers on either side of the local study area boundaries. If we look at moose, for example, that has a different local study area. In that case, it's 10 kilometers from the center line of the alternatives, 500 meters from supportive infrastructure, but the regional study area extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Then we look at caribou. caribou have an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the two alternatives, and from the same distance from supportive infrastructure camps. So it has a bigger distance around it to define the local study area. And then the regional study area for caribou includes entire ranges of caribou, which is these are very, very large areas. Next, and finally for wildlife, let's look at Wolverine. Wolverine has an 11-kilometer buffer from the center line of the alternatives and from the supportive infrastructure, and it extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Let's have a look now what that means in terms of maps. So these next few maps will illustrate the different types of study areas I just discussed. So this first one is the general study areas that I was talking about. The next slide shows the different local and regional study areas for moose. And then after that, we have the wildlife study areas for wolverine. So as you can tell, you can see the 50-kilometer buffer around there, much larger area. And then finally, the largest study area you can see here, you can see the local study area on the actual map, and then the regional study area, which includes two ranges for caribou, and that is in the upper right corner. So it's a much larger area. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife again and some of the criteria or valued components associated with wildlife, just to give you an idea of and a better understanding through examples. So for wildlife, you might have forest birds, you might have raptors, you might have shorebirds or waterfowl, or bog and fen birds like muskeg birds and other wetland birds. You might have bats or fur-bearing animals like lynx or rabbits. Ungulates, which are moose, for example. Amphibians and reptiles, and then pollinating insects as well. So the indicators or the ways of measuring those could be, for example, changes to habitat availability, the quantity of habitat available. Is that impacted by the road? Could be changes to abundance, meaning actual numbers, or the distribution, the spatial distribution, where these animals are over the land or water. Could be changes in the species richness. And when we talk about that, we mean the diversity of species, the number of different species. Could be changes to survival and reproduction. Could be changes to predator access, habitat use, and population. Or it could be changes in wildlife mortality or due to stress from. So let's talk a little bit about the baseline studies for birds. Spring and fall aerial water bird surveys were conducted in 2019 and 2020. And some of the things that we found were that the large lakes, and this isn't that surprising, were staging areas for waterfowl. Smaller lakes and rivers aren't really used that much by migrating waterfowl. We also conducted breeding bird surveys in 2020 and 2021, and we did listening counts at 263 stations. And we also used things called acoustic recording units at many different locations, actually 89 different locations, to listen to the sounds in these areas. The next slide shows some pictures that were taken from our breeding bird survey fieldwork. We also conducted baseline studies on bats to look basically for how many species are present. So we looked at, as I mentioned, bat diversity or number of species, and we used listening devices, what we call ultrasonic recorders. And we did surveys at 10 different locations. We found 5 species of bat, including the little brown bat, which is endangered in Ontario. We conducted a number of baseline studies on caribou as well. Caribou aerial surveys were conducted in 2018, 2019, and 2021. These are aerial surveys where we have biologists looking down and counting the number of caribou and identifying male, female, and making other observations about other large mammals. We also conducted in 2020 a caribou calving study, both by foot and by helicopter. We conducted a caribou collaring study in 2021, and that helped us identify calving areas where community members or community members where caribou would have their young, winter areas, and identify travel corridors by being able to track the individual caribou uh, across the landscape. And so far, the data has shown that most collared caribou are of the what we call the eastern migratory population that winters in wooded areas, but actually has their young along the Hudson Bay shoreline. Next are a few pictures of some of our from some of our caribou aerial surveys. And then the slide after that shows photos from our collaring study as well. So let's talk a little bit next about baseline studies for Wolverine and amphibians. We conducted, starting in 2021, a Wolverine occupancy study. And so we set up sampling stations called run poles that at 25 different sites within 10 kilometers of the planned road center line. And then these stations were set up to include what we call snag posts to collect hair from the animals that would visit. And then there were wildlife cameras set up. From this work, not only did we get a boundary of Wolverine in Ontario, and we've gotten some really interesting results from that. We also did some amphibian studies where we sampled for calling frogs by using these acoustic recording units that we had set up for breeding bird studies. And this allowed for evening surveys to be done in these remote muskeg or wetland areas that we wouldn't be able to get access to otherwise. So next, let's move on to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge. A big part of an environmental assessment is Indigenous knowledge. We have, with the Webequie Supply Road project, an Indigenous knowledge program. We need communities to share their Indigenous knowledge with the technical team to help us identify potential project effects. This helps us avoid or reduce potential effects on Indigenous rights and interests. As part of doing this work, we take the Indigenous knowledge that we are able to collect. We make sure that it is kept confidential to whatever degree the community would like us to. And then we combine this information with the Western science information to very comprehensively identify impacts of the project. We want to work together with your community to collect important Indigenous knowledge. As I mentioned, we will respect the need for confidentiality. We have communicated with communities about the need to collect Indigenous knowledge for the project, and we've also invited communities to participate in our Indigenous knowledge program. So again, this is a very, very important part of this environmental and impact assessment, collecting Indigenous knowledge, and we really would like to encourage communities to provide that input to us so we can make sure that we've assessed impacts of the project very, very thoroughly. Let's move now to talk a bit about consideration and evaluation of alternatives. We have different route alternatives that have been developed by working with community members. Of the two alternatives, One is what we call the community preferred route, and the other is based on where the best land for road building is. So it's sort of the technically preferred route. We're also looking at different locations for sources of road building material, such as gravel and rock. This next map shows the two alternatives. In yellow is the community preferred route, which was derived by Webequie First Nation members meeting over a fairly long period of time to discuss the best possible route for the road. And then the green line represents technically preferred version of that route, looking at the best areas to travel through in terms of best terrain to build in generally, and other factors as well. Each alternative does get evaluated in detail, and there are many factors involved in that evaluation, such as natural environment, Indigenous knowledge, land and resource use and interest, socioeconomic and cultural heritage, and of course the technical side, cost, constructability, and safety. And the purpose of the evaluation of these routes and aggregate or rock sources is to identify a preferred route and preferred locations for sources for aggregate and rock that has the least potential for bad effects, for negative effects, and the greatest opportunity for controlling those negative or bad effects, and offers the community the greatest benefit as well. The evaluation of alternatives also considers other facilities that are part of building the road, such as temporary access roads to get to those gravel pits and quarries, for example, to get to the laydown and storage yards, construction camps, as well as bridges. Let's talk a little bit about consultation approach and next steps. We will be talking to communities in the next few months. We have 3 rounds of consultation planned as part of the environmental assessment phase of the project. This presentation is for round 1. But as you can see in this slide, we have the 2 other rounds, round 2 coming up hopefully in fall of 2022, and in winter or spring of 2023, the final round, round 3. This round talks about the overall IA process. It talks about the IK program. It talks about criteria and indicators, the evaluation of alternatives. The next round, round 2, will summarize the input that we got, identify alternatives, identify preferred routes for the road and aggregate or rock source areas, and provide some preliminary engineering design elements. And then finally, round 3 will be a summary of round 2, what we found in round 2, and a summary of preliminary effects, early effects based on our analysis of the project, and proposed ways of managing project impacts or mitigating impacts, limiting or controlling impacts, and then talking about follow-up monitoring, either during construction or post-construction. We will be collecting your feedback on the project in many ways, including community meetings, interviews, open houses, live streaming sessions, the project website, and social media. There are many different ways available to collect feedback from your community, and we welcome input from you in terms of how you would like to communicate with us. In terms of next steps, let me just talk about where we are here now. We are looking for input to finalize the criteria and indicators, as well as identify study areas for the valued components. We're looking to continue with our baseline studies and collect Indigenous knowledge. Now, in fall of 2022, we're looking for input to evaluation of alternatives and selection of the preferred route and locations for the construction material sources, aggregate and rock. And we'll be doing the preliminary engineering design of the road. Then, in winter of 2023, we'll be getting input to preliminary effects, assessment of the project, and input to proposed impact management mitigation, and follow-up monitoring. And then finally, in the summer and fall of 2023, there would be a review of the draft and final environmental assessment report or impact statement, the document that goes to both the provincial and federal governments. We want to hear from you. Please provide us with your comments through the project website, which is supplyroad.ca. Speak with the project team after the presentation. Fill out a feedback form. We have contact information on the screen for you. We welcome your input. We will respond to you, and it will make the environmental assessment and impact assessment better with your input. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech, and we will see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And now we're going to have a brief discussion of issues or concerns raised by your community, Aroland First Nation, during the, actually it was during the terms of reference process, commenting on the terms of reference. And the only comment that Aroland provided was expressed concern regarding the need for cumulative effects assessment associated with this project. And of course, as part of this individual environmental assessment, cumulative effects assessment is done for any past, current, or reasonably foreseeable future projects. And each individual environmental assessment is subject to cumulative effects assessment requirements as well too. And there is a regional assessment being undertaken by the federal agency, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada as well. So those are occurring. The other concerns that were raised by the community related more to what is now called the Northern Road Link project. The comments came just prior to the official announcement of this project. So that project is of particular concern to the community, given that it links the planned Martin Falls Community Access Road to the Ring of Fire, and there would be impacts. Of course, there would be impacts on Aroland as the community at the southern end of those roads. So those were the comments that were received from Aroland, and now maybe we'll see if we have any questions or comments from community members, and it doesn't look like we do. So even though we don't have any now, that doesn't mean we won't have any down the road. This community meeting, virtual community meeting, will be made available on our website, and we welcome you to visit our website at supplyroad.ca. There's a lot of other information about the project there, and we look forward to hearing from you. You can contact us in a lot of different ways, and we want to hear from you to make this environmental assessment better and more comprehensive, and make sure it represents as broad a group of opinions and comments as possible. So thank you again for joining us today, Miigwech, and hopefully we can come and visit your community very soon. Just contact us and we'll be happy to visit anytime. So thank you again for listening, Miigwech, and we will see you soon.